the convergence of violence, the notion of violence around law, architecture, and planning in spatial imaginary. We see that quite often. In James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, he says, certain forms of knowledge and control require a narrowing of vision. So then he gets into examples of scientific forestry, urban planning, land management, and so on and so forth. Similarly, the work by Tim Mitchell on Egypt in his book, The Rule of Experts, has a dramatically arresting vision of the way Egypt is imagined by those who seek to bring solutions to Egypt's problems. So those who come thinking that they have solutions to Egypt's problems must first, of course, diagnose what the problems are. And he quotes a World Bank report and a USAID report, with due respect to USAID, which is getting eradicated as we speak. Basically the approach of both the reports is to engage in a spatial imagination of Egypt. So Egypt is presented spatially as a large country with a narrow strip of productivity that runs along the Nile. And because of that, the population is squeezed along the border of the Nile, basically. So the basic sort of image that you get is all the problems that Egypt has, it says, is the result of this sort of basic dynamic between geography and demography. And once you reduce the problem to one of geography and demography, solutions present themselves on their own, including, for example, the sort of approach that you should have towards agriculture. But if you don't reduce it to a kind of a tension or a relationship between demography and geography, but one that takes patterns of historical inequality into account, both within Egyptian society as well as in terms of the relationship with successive colonial powers, whether it's Britain or France, you might have yielded different answers. And therefore, it depends on how you spatially imagine places and then you think that you have found the problem. Finally, I would say that the one other thing about land is also that sometimes whenever we talk about land, we think of it as something so concrete. Nothing can be more tangible or physical than land. But the odd thing is that, in fact, this sense of certainty, I want to suggest, is really an export or a colonization of the minds of all non-lawyers by the legal community. This idea of certainty exists really only in the law. Spatially, I don't know that you all think about land in the same way as such an object of certainty where the delineation, the boundary, the uses are all so obvious all the time. And we see that in this tension between the spatial indeterminacy or contingency, indeterminacy may be too strong a word, but the contingency of space with the certainty of law. We see that beautifully coming together, particularly when we look at deeply colonized spaces like in Palestine, and the use of space and law as two instruments in tandem to order life between Israelis and the Palestinians. And this beautiful book recently by Oren Yiftachel and Sandy Kedar called Emptied Lands, a work of beautiful legal geography, actually puts it well, very well. In terms of the role of law, it says, referring to several examples, but particularly the examples of two doctrines in law. The Mawat doctrine, which is, the Mawat is a form of state land. So the basic idea is that it's actually based on an Ottoman legal idea that if you don't use the land long enough, the land reverts to the state, basically. And Israel has very much sort of incorporated that idea into its legal system. And this is part of the basis for what Israel calls the dead Negev doctrine, which is that basically land becomes no man's land. It's nobody's land because you don't use it, although you say that you have a documentary evidence that you own the land, but ultimately you didn't use it. And therefore it comes back to the state, it's a Mawat land, and it becomes, almost as though nobody owned it. So it's no man's land. And this dead Negev doctrine, which in international law has a parallel called terra nullius, is something that is actively used and has been used by Israel to dispossess not just Palestinians, but the Bedouin community. The Bedouin community is constantly told that although you've been living in this, they will say that they've been living in the place for hundreds of years, but then it'll boil down to whether they have any documentary evidence. Even if they had documentary evidence, did they use the land sufficiently enough to say that they were in fact occupying the land? Very similar to, in fact, the question that John Marshall asks in his case, Johnson versus McIntosh. He says, the way to show that you own land is to settle it, is to cultivate it, for example. But if you're a nomad and you're just, harvesting forest produce and you're, going through the land and you're kind of partially relying on it seasonally during some months of the year, or even sometimes once every 3 years you return to the land, you're basically a wanderer. The land doesn't belong to you, So there is that conception of settlement as at the core of title, and therefore of sovereignty and power that flows through the logic of the Western legal system. So regarding this in the Israeli context, I will just briefly say what Iftachel and Kedar say, that law is never a neutral organizing envelope, simply articulating impartially the rules of the game, as commonly assumed by concepts such as the rule of law. Quite the contrary, legal procedures are often shaped and imbued within power relations and should thus be analyzed as part of the ceaseless struggles over resources, identities, and influence. I think it nicely summarizes basically the logic of the struggle over land since before colonial period. So let me move on to the next. So if this is kind of where we are historically, the converging point between law, architecture, and violence has taken this form. What does the modern experience tell us? Here I'll move gradually into discussing some modern trends and then get into some examples from my practice. So the first thing that we see is the real sort of organized, sort of framework of not just thought but action to transform the world by intervening in land, using law, using architecture and planning, was through the period of what we call development. The period of development roughly dated from the post-colonial period of the 1940s to now. In theory, we are still in the period of development, in that there are many, the framework of development hasn't left us. We still have the sustainable development goals, for example, of the World Bank, of the UN, and the framework of development is still very much the framework within which financing conversations take place about development financing or even climate financing. So we were very much still in the era of development. But if you look at particularly the key moment when land became much more central to as a focal point of intervention that involved law, architecture, and planning, it's in the urban turn that began to characterize development strategies. A lot of after independence, a lot of developing countries' initial strategy towards development was to emphasize rural development because they were most concerned about food security and increasing, for example, rural land productivity was very critical for them, which of course involved dealing with the question of land, but it was actually the urban turn from the 1960s and 70s that began to, shall we say, raise the sort of the temperature on the whole question of land in a very explicit way. So national development strategies began to pay much more specific attention to the urban question as informal settlements proliferated, for example, in Latin America, as more and more people began to leave their rural lands because of failures of wrong-headed agricultural strategies that had been pursued in the 50s and 60s. There was a very high level of joblessness, and population growth was very high. And what we see is the turn to sort of recognizing the importance of the urban as both a site of problem and in the coming decades as, in fact, the key solution for alleviating many of these very same problems. And two particular periods of development planning or development strategy we have witnessed during the subsequent decades. They can be broadly categorized as of course, etatism as well as neoliberalism. That is an emphasis on the state as the main instrument as well as the framework for the realization of the goals of development. And then its opposite, which is to de-emphasize the state but to rely on the market and private institutions as a solution to development challenges. And we saw that in the 1970s to the 1990s. Through all of these periods, the urban transformations that we have seen have, I would suggest, reified and intensified the social and spatial inequalities, which have led to much higher contestations over land and housing and resources. And we see the consequence of that, especially when I mention some of the examples that I have, that I'm dealing with currently. You will see that most of these are in the context of urbanization and urban challenges, whether the regular everyday form of urban renewal to creation of new cities like eco-cities, new forms of urban imagination. We see it repeatedly in country after country. We also see the centrality of land as a key part of development, the turn to development and development planning in the post-World War II period, emerging as a new terrain for a variety of interventions that are justified in the name of the environment. First, in the name of saving species or environmental protection from the 1980s onwards, but increasingly framed in terms of climate, battling climate change, especially in the last 15 years, 20 years or so. We see numerous instances in which assertion of state rights, particularly through eminent domain over land and dispossession of communities that had been living on their territories, whether they're indigenous or not, is increasingly common and are justified in the name of battling climate change or for green justification, or what scholars refer to as green grabbing, for example. Land grabbing is rife, and it's an ongoing process of assertion of power in different countries around the world. In fact, some of the examples that I give, you'll see that that is in fact the case. So let me move to those examples. So I'll mention a few. These are carefully just selected examples of cases that have actually intervened in with these countries over the last roughly, I would say, 2 years. These are all from 2022, 23, 24, or maybe 3 years. So there is the NEOM project, which many of you probably will be aware of. So it's because it's such an infamous project among architects, or famous, perhaps. I shouldn't say infamous. NEOM projects, Saudi Arabia. Then we have a case from Nigeria, which is actually ongoing because 2 other communities have just been evicted last week in the same area, in fact, where the Ayatoro and Okababa communities were evicted in Lagos. 10,000 people have been evicted this time. And I'm actually intervening. My office, I just approved a press release just today. It'll be issued tomorrow on the ongoing eviction of 10,000 people. But I will come to that. The third is eviction of almost 40,000 people in Angkor Wat, or near Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which also raises questions of the responsibility of the World Heritage Committee of the UNESCO and the responsibility it has for ensuring that World Heritage designation doesn't become a cover for carrying out activities that significantly have negative impacts and violate the rights of people who live there. Then we have the Rempang Island, Indonesia case. The Rempang Island case involved basically China's largest solar manufacturer essentially investing in this Rempang Island to make it into a joint industrial plus tourism sector, but mainly with the interest of using it for solar investment. There are other cases in Indonesia as well, but this is again connected with the question of climate change because of the justification about, and the need for solar energy. And then finally, we have the Ogi community case in Kenya, which involves a community of indigenous people, the Ogi community in the Mau forest of Kenya, who have been evicted violently with their homes torched and burned down by Kenyan security forces because the land on which they were sitting has forests which are supposedly under conservation for a carbon credit scheme where a company has signed a contract to sort of purchase the carbon credits, so therefore they're in the way or they are threats. So these are some cases that I just thought I'll mention, but I'm happy to sort of unpack some of these cases if necessary. Then beyond development, then we come to, I guess, the big dynamic, in the world today, which is the increasing number of conflicts and war. Now, conflict and war are on a continuum. What is conflict doesn't necessarily become war, but conflicts can become worse over time. So think about conflict and war as a continuum, really. Sometimes you can have conflicts that are largely non-violent, but conflicts can escalate gradually into various forms of violence. First at the level of individual attacks or threats, but slowly escalate to more organized forms, and eventually involving organized political communities going at each other, at which point it's almost like civil war. If it is within a country or spills over across the border, it's an international conflict. The legal implications are very significant because different rules apply depending on whether you categorize a conflict as war or not. Or the language used in international humanitarian law under the Geneva Conventions is that something will be governed by international humanitarian law if it is an armed conflict. And it should be an armed conflict of either an international character or armed conflict not of an international character, meaning it's like a civil war. the question of whether a conflict is serious enough to warrant the designation of the meaning of conflict under the Geneva Conventions is something that states quarrel about all the time. They will say, yeah, there is something going on, but it's like a police action, we're taking care of it. It's like little quarrel. It's like family dispute. Don't worry about it. But the reality might be that there is, in fact, heavy weapons being used and a large number of lives being lost, and it looks almost like a civil war. And so you have to wonder why Geneva Conventions is not relevant. So it's a push and pull. It's not that obvious. There is no neutral body that can designate a particular conflict as a conflict within the definition of the Geneva Conventions. So this is a major issue, the legal implications, which also goes to the last point, which is the distinction between the two broad areas of laws that govern war and conflict. The first is jus ad bellum, or law of war, and the second is jus in bello, or law in war. The laws of war are rules that basically determine when a use of force is legal. So a use of force in self-defense, for example, is legal under the UN Charter. But the jus in bello are rules that determine how you are supposed to fight if your original reason to begin fighting is legitimate or legal. Their international humanitarian law, Geneva Conventions, and all the other rules come into play. And the spatial imaginaries that are implied in these distinctions are very significant, especially as the world has become more and more urban. The distinction between a civilian and a combatant is increasingly problematic. It's hard to draw, because not just that the original idea behind the Geneva Conventions that combatants will wear uniforms, for example, is no longer accurate in many conflicts, but also the spatial distancing that was implied in original rules of war, that combatants will go onto a battlefield and face each other, whereas human settlements with civilians will be separate. So it was easier to sort of draw a distinction between a civilian and a combatant, but increasingly it's become more and more difficult with contentious issues, as we know from many ongoing conflicts. The question of conflict, also particularly slow conflict or gradual conflict that becomes subject to different rules, raises a question of situations like South Africa, which began really as a spatially organized form to separate and exploit communities, but gradually emerged into forms of conflict, which sometimes threatened to spill over into forms of armed conflict. Certainly the ANC was prepared to fight it out. They were organized as an armed group, but we are all thankful that things didn't fall apart that badly, and that apartheid ended more or less peacefully then. Israel is another example of the act of violence being gradual and grinding and incremental and slow. See, what happens, for example, in a place like Palestine is not a sudden thing. It happens over decades and decades and decades, and it happens over one house after another, one orchard after another, one road after another. So what will be Palestinian land today, tomorrow a decision might be taken to build a road through it, and therefore you're being cut off from that land, or that you've been taking your goats for grazing on a land, but tomorrow suddenly the military declares that that place is needed for testing of weapons. So you can no longer access that land. This is a constant issue, and I just chose this map as an example of how, say, transportation planning works as a way to create apartheid. It's the backbone. It's like you're looking at an animal's skeletal structure. This is a skeleton of apartheid. This is what governs the space, right? The segregated road systems. Some roads that are accessible to to Palestinians, others to Israelis, and then there are other roads that cut across, and so on and so forth. So there is that. In fact, the issue of spatial segregation has become so significant. It's way beyond just apartheid South Africa and apartheid or ongoing spatial segregation in Israel, Palestine. It's unfortunately more and more of a global phenomenon in countries around the world. And I have a number of examples of that in my report in 2022, where I define spatial segregation specifically and get into a lot of tricky questions, including the question of what if people just want to voluntarily live by themselves? Is that self-segregation also problematic from a human rights point of view? So then we come to on the continuum from conflict to war, we come to full-blown war, where mass destruction of housing is part of the military strategy of acquiring victory. And we have seen that through war continuously, including from more recently, of course, from World War II, from Vietnam, from the war against the invasion of Iraq, the destruction of Fallujah during 2003. We have now, of course, seen in the case of Ukraine and Gaza and Myanmar, and I will just mention some of them, but basically the reason why I decided to write this report, as Professor Riyar mentioned, on domicile, is to just say that, look, we are all increasingly an urban planet. Most of us are living in urban areas where the civilian combatant distinction is increasingly difficult to know. We don't know who is civilian and who is not. And most of the military infrastructure is located, like communication infrastructure, in cities. And wars are going to be very damaging for human beings, much more damaging than they were historically. And we'll find it harder to recover because it's way harder to rebuild destroyed urban areas than destroyed, say, sparsely populated settlements. Just the debris of it and the poisonous impact of it on the soil. I mean, there is so much that is going wrong because we are an urban planet and we are fighting more, not less wars. This is not a sustainable way to live on this planet. So that's why I wrote this piece, this report, and I'll just mention briefly, I guess I should stop now, wrap it up in 5 minutes. So I'll just briefly sort of mention the case of Gaza, Ukraine, and Myanmar, that I won't get into the other cases, but mainly to say that the extent and the level of destruction of housing in Gaza, in terms of an instantiation of violence, which is, according to those who perpetrated, sanctioned by law. They don't consider it as illegal. In fact, they think that law is on their side. Is beyond anything that we have seen in any recorded instance of armed conflict recently. But it's also wrong, in my view, to think about a conflict situation like Gaza purely by looking at the pattern of destruction, because all you see is rubble. But these were places where people lived, and life was real, and they had cafeterias, houses, and they had orchards, and they had proper roads. Yes, there were roads before they were dug up. And it's very important to sort of recognize that. In that spirit, I'll just briefly show you this video, which is actually developed by this incredible researchers who have this virtual reality show called The Phoenix of Gaza. I encourage you to really invite this group to come and do a presentation. We did that at MIT last month. I was so inspired by what they had done. Basically, they shot these videos. This virtual reality production was before the war started in 2023, October, but they were able to sort of have a before and after sense of it, and you see through virtual reality. So you're literally walking through the buildings which were destroyed, and then after they were destroyed, you are still you're able to three-dimensionally be part of the reality. But this is Gaza before it was destroyed. So, because I think a lot of people didn't even know what it looked like. Okay, nothing is for me.
I'm Yusuf Al-Hilo. I did not ask to be born a Palestinian. I just got lucky. Even luckier to be born in Gaza. I'm a journalist and filmmaker. Normally, I tell other people's stories. Today, I will tell you my story. After almost 10 years away in London, I went back to my motherland, Gaza, a city I grew up in. A city I know like the back of my hand. 2023, a year that will be documented in history until the end of time. I was fortunate enough to be able to capture the beauty of Gaza before the world turned its back on it. This story will show the world the beauty of Gaza, the city of my childhood, the character, the resilience, and steadfastness of its people. On this visit, I ended up documenting a world that is no more. A world I want to share with you. I bring to you the Phoenix of Gaza.
From there, we are in this. This is destruction of Gaza. Some images. Gaza was 77.8% urban before the war started. So you see the consequence. So thanks to remote sensing, we have very good information and with all the limitations. So some remote sensing is not able to capture, for example, lateral damage to housing because you have view from the top. And you can look at whether a building has collapsed or not, but the other forms of destruction are often not. Because none of these analyses are field verified yet because we cannot have access to the site yet. But it's still better than what used to be the case before. So if you look at, for example, this is Myanmar, some before and after pictures, because Myanmar military constantly uses long-range artillery shelling to destroy housing during its civil war. This is before, after, before, after, before, after, before, after. So you get a sense of that. The destruction is massive. The impacts are unlike anything that we have seen in conflicts. We are living through one of the most conflict-prone eras of modern history. And I would like to sort of just say that this level of destruction and this level of infliction of suffering is, again, because of the large-scale sort of land strategy and urbanization strategy that we pursued for decades. Populations are more urban for a variety of reasons, because of conscious planning And we are seeing the result of that when urbanization is not also simultaneously accompanied by more meaningful peace-building strategies and prevention of conflict. Otherwise, we end up with this. An urban world is also a recipe for a world of rubble, basically. The other thing I would say is, so what do we do now? Let me leave you with that. I think that, I think we have to start in many ways. One is that we as professionals, as lawyers, architects, planners, should ask harder questions about ourselves. We should ask questions about what is the meaning of codes of ethics and the ethics of the professions. It unfortunately remains quite weak. In international law, for example, we don't really have any binding code of ethics for international lawyers. There is no bar exam that international lawyers have to pass. They pass their national bar exams. The national bar exams don't even take international law seriously. In most of the American bar exams, international law is not a required subject in bar exam. They are tested only on domestic law. So what do you expect really in terms of ethical commitments? International law is not even a compulsory course in law schools, in many law schools. I'm just reminded of this, particularly with regard to land, the lack of anything really meaningful in the existing codes of ethics. I was looking at the US National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics, and all it says is this: under all is the land, okay? What does that mean? I mean, what commitment in terms of ethics does it imply? I'm reminded of this architect, Pakistani architect and planner, Arif Hassan, very well known for his work with informal settlements. And he took an oath in 1983, which was replicated by a lot of other Pakistani planners and architects. And this is what he said: I will not do projects that will irreparably damage the ecology and environment of the area in which they are located. I will not do projects that increase poverty, dislocate people, and destroy the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of communities that live in the city. I will not do projects that destroy multi-class public space and violate building bylaws and zoning regulations. And I will always object to insensitive projects that do all this, provided I can offer viable alternatives. A code of ethics is better than none, in my view. On the legal pathways, there are many that I won't really go into, but there are international law-based claims that are ongoing currently. The ICJ case is ongoing. The international criminal law is another pathway with the ongoing cases in the ICC, the International Criminal Court. National courts and national governments can do quite a lot. They can even, not all of them have to involve legal proceedings. They can change, for example, the rules of engagement for their military, so that military targeting decisions in armed conflicts don't end up destroying housing so on a massive scale as though it doesn't matter. Right now, the targeting practices totally ignore that dimension. But ultimately, I would say that the legal pathways are not important because we'll be able to prosecute every wrongdoer, or that we'll be able to create through deterrence, a fear of law. So there'll be less occurrences of, this kind of, mass destruction of housing. But instead, what I look for really when I advocate for, say, domicide in legal terms is the effect of the law, which has more impact on the questions of legitimation of the entire war effort, as well as the framing of a war as a just war or an unjust war. It's a war of narratives, really. And if framing it as domicide helps in shall we say, highlighting the ignored elements more, then I'm happy to do it. I won't get into Judith Clark. So I just mentioned a couple of recent inspiring things. As Professor Riyad said, I remain an optimist that despite all the obviously negative trends that we see around the world, that with enough collective effort, solidarity, and collective action, we can change things for the better. And we see, for example, I was really inspired when the German, Federation of German Architects adopted or endorsed my call to recognize domicile as their official position in Germany. Now, this is an influential body because they've got national chapters all over Germany, and many German lawmakers are involved in it. And I hope that brings some sense to German foreign policy, which has been a catastrophe on support of genocidal actions in Gaza. I should also mention or plug this ongoing year-long exhibit at the Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt Museum on domicide by a digital journalist, Mona Chalabi, and the architecture firm Site2 Research. So it's a year-long exhibit, so if you happen to go to New York, do drop in and see it. It's going to be there, I think, until August. And finally, I will just leave you, since we are in a school of school that prepares people through education. I think education is key. It goes beyond codes of ethics for professionals, whether they are lawyers, architects, etc. It goes to the way we think about what is legitimate knowledge and the way we sort of explain or try to come up with reasons why some forms of knowledge are important and are not others. I would really pitch that there is a real place for international law and human rights in planning and architecture education. It should be a compulsory basic learning requirement that there should be a more fundamental understanding of not just land use, but property. Land use is different from property. It's related, but not the same. Planning schools in the US, for example, before I arrived in my department, no one taught property. There were some practitioner kind of courses on land use, but that doesn't really prepare people to be ethical planners. You have to understand the history and the meaning and the, shall we say, the diversity of property. Without that, land use would be like handing a tool to build, a furniture for someone, who has never worked with wood before or who doesn't know anything about the properties of wood. Why would you trust somebody to build a furniture like that? As I said already, in law schools and all places where international law and human rights are taught, there needs to be also much more deep, fundamental, critical approaches to education. And so I do think that the path ahead is steep, but it's not impossible. And as I said, with collective effort, determination, and a sense of purpose guided by values, we can actually make an impact, even in what appears to be a very dark place that we are in right now. And on that note, I'll just end. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah, great. So Professor Rajagopal will take questions, so you're please welcome to raise your hand. We do have a microphone somewhere. Oh, is there? Thanks a lot. You want to I can pass it out. No, I'll pass it. I just wanted to see a question. I can, yeah. Just raise your hand and I'll...
So within the framework of your presentation, what I got was violence is the employment of a framework that you impose upon a diverse demographic. Is there, do you perceive violence in this case as a binary solution, or is it more depending on the framework that you're employing, it produces variation in the forms of violence? If that makes sense.
Are you saying that should we think about violence as something that exists independently outside of the frameworks? Whether it's law, architecture, or planning?
I'm wondering if there's variation based on the field. That makes sense.
Of course there is variation. I mean, variations exist even within the field. Approaching violence as an international law category is different from approaching violence, for example, as an economic law category. Economic law does a lot of violence too. Economic violence that raises questions of, well, what counts as violence really? So of course there are variations, and certainly there are variations between law and architecture and planning, or any other field for that matter. But I think ultimately it's important to sort of remember that the relationship between violence and these other things, that we take to be the antithesis of violence very often. Law is supposed to be what violence is not, or I leave you with the planning and architecture issues. I think we need to sort of go beyond this kind of way of thinking. We need to think about violence really as something that is implicated in the very production of the world in which we live, which is ordered through things like law and spatial arrangements and technologies of intervention, often intended for good purposes, or justified through reasoning that appears to be neutral at the very least. But we have to pay close attention to the actual operation and its effects, and be ready to question them if they turn out to be, something other than what they're not. So.
Thank you. I may be stepping on very sensitive ground here, but I'm very curious to know whether the UN can intervene at all in a recent plan of Donald Trump's to solicit interest from African countries in taking displaced Palestinians. To me, that seems to be like, basically in order to exercise his interest in turning Gaza into a resort. So, yeah, are you able to answer that?
I mean, the plan to sort of make Gaza into the so-called Riviera of the Middle East by forcibly removing all the Palestinians from Gaza is a plan that I have already condemned publicly in a press statement and also in interviews. It's a grossly immoral and illegal act. It's one of the grossest crimes under international law, this kind of mass expulsion. It's a violation of the Genocide Convention. It's a violation of, what is known as a grave breach of international humanitarian law under the Geneva Conventions, and might also constitute a crime of persecution under international criminal law. So there are numerous ways in which this is illegal. It's also grossly it's just indecent. It lacks elementary sense of ethics. And I hope that the African countries or any other country would see it for what it is. It's a naked assertion of a return to colonial rule for a bunch of people sitting in Western capitals to decide what happens to the non-Western parts of the world. We thought we were done with that, with that phase of history. And some lessons at least were drawn from it. Now, if this is the world that some people are aspiring to go back to and they say, let's make countries great again, they will face a very serious pushback from around the world. I don't think African countries can get away with being complicit in something like this. African street is different from some of the African leadership, and it won't be the same. That's my broad, educated guess. But I must also tell you, in my conversation with the African diplomats, including, just during my visit 2 weeks ago to Geneva, I didn't sense anything other than complete condemnation of plans that are being discussed about Gaza. So sometimes, these kinds of ideas are floated as trial balloons just to see what the response is, how much people are outraged, or if somebody is open to having a preliminary negotiation and say, okay, if we do it, what's in it for us? Basically, the idea is to think of it as a negotiating exercise. But I don't think it's going to fly.
Susan.
Great. Thanks, Raj. I always appreciate hearing your thoughts on these topics. I think one thing that I was particularly struck by in the presentation is just the breadth of tools, both for analysis that you have to rely on and for dissemination. That could be anything from looking at oral histories, archives, satellite imagery, legal documents, then exhibitions. I know the former rapporteur also made a documentary, has a podcast. There's this incredible breadth of ways that you're collating data and then also disseminating it out. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit about how that adds either opportunity and complexity to the work that you do.
Yeah, it's an opportunity and a complexity. It kind of sums it up. but it's basically a shitload of work. That's the only thing I would say. I mean, I didn't bargain to, first of all, when I took on this, I thought, okay, the way they sell this job to you is that it's a 3-month commitment. During the interview that I had with this group of ambassadors, I said, so what does it involve? And they said, well, it's a 3-month commitment per year. So you think you're an academic, and technically I'm on a 9-month contract with MIT. So can I do it? In theory, yeah, of course I can do it. There is summer, there is in between semesters, but this is a 24/7, 365 days of the year job. I mean, no vacation has been possible with family without being interrupted with some urgent media, political, some other issue that I have to take time off. And so I can never travel without my computer. So, and it's the number of media and technology platforms and tools which are useful, but also they're necessary, but they're also enormous time suckers, really. I mean, just think of the lack of the background coordination that UN experts we are doing now using platforms like Signal, which is another layer of enormous level of time commitment. But does this help or not? Absolutely, it helps. It's better than, for example, the practice even 4 years ago when there wasn't a Signal group. When if I do a communication, say on the Nigeria case, but I think that the Special Rapporteur on internally displaced people, the Rapporteur on violence against women, other experts should be involved. The only way I could do it is I draft the statement or the letter, and then I would have to have my staff send it through their staff to them. It's email, and they look at it, they'll get, so it's like, take forever, really. Very urgent responses are not possible. And now we can sort things out very quickly behind the scenes and decide who's taking the lead on a particular issue, who's joining, what will be the main message of it, and then somebody gets to work. So it makes it easier, but I feel sometimes like I don't have time for anything else, really. I haven't read a decent novel in like in 2 years, so this can be a real problem.
Yeah, just thank you, Reg. Thank you very much for that presentation. I wonder just to what degree the concept of eminent domain plays into the whole discussion that you have, especially when it works across borders, and the notion of just compensation. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, so when I was talking about development here, I wanted to just say that the way land is at the convergence of the violence of law, architecture, and planning is really sort of operationalized through the rules of property. And eminent domain is really sort of related with the idea of property. And of course, both are related to the idea of sovereignty. Eminent domain is only a domestic sort of exercise of sovereignty by a state, whereas outside the exercise of the same sovereignty becomes territorial sovereignty. But internally, it's the assertion of supreme authority. And that's basically where eminent domain comes from. It comes from sovereignty. And oddly enough, if you ask, where does this eminent domain authority come from? Did you all vote for it in our countries? The answer is no. We never really voted that our governments will have some, unstated reserved right over everything that we own in perpetuity. We never voted for that idea. And it's not clear from any of the constitutional texts that govern our rights or the powers of governments. Where does it say in any constitution that eminent domain involves this unquestioned supreme authority? Why is it not subject to limitations, for example, much more actively? Here I must say that the ugly truth is that all modern legal systems rest on a medieval fiction, which goes back to the rights of kings. It's a royal prerogative that kings own their lands. It's the ultimate idea from English law, that all lands belong to the king, basically. And the king can do as he or she wishes, or the queen. And eminent domain was bequeathed in this form to colonies that were colonized by, say, Britain. So India, for example, its idea of land acquisition was rooted in its 1894 land acquisition law, which explicitly sort of gave the unlimited authority to acquire land based on an implicit theory of eminent domain, which itself wasn't defined anywhere or even mentioned in that law. The word eminent and domain were not there in the law. But on the other hand, this is the theory that the British colonial regime asserted suddenly an unlimited right to acquire any land. Now, oddly enough, although India was actually governed by the Mughals before the British came in and by kings, kingdoms were all over India. But if you look at the land relations as they were administered by kings, there is no equivalent of a British monarch's assertion of supreme authority over all land and all forests, for example. The kings were custodians of land and property often owned by other powerful societal entities. For example, temple lands in old Hindu India were governed by temples. And the kings would recognize that, but would have no power to take over that land or to transfer the land from a Hindu temple to, say, somebody else. It's really a purely British myth that was imported into India, this idea of eminent domain. It's a colonial baggage, really, that many of these countries live with, unfortunately. But this baggage wasn't recognized for the wonderful tool that it was by the post-colonial elites early enough. They became independent. For example, Ghana becomes independent in 1961. African countries don't recognize what a gold mine of a tool they're sitting on with this incredibly powerful thing called eminent domain until in mid-70s, the World Bank issues a report and says land management in Africa is basically unscientific because land is not governed according to market principles, and there should be emergence of land markets. This is the emergence of the neoliberal turn as well. And that report has a profound influence on African countries, which one after the other suddenly reform their land tenure arrangements and assert the rights of the state over what in Africa is largely communal property. Okay, tribes and communities had control over land, but suddenly the state is the supreme authority over land. So what we have seen is something really quite inexcusable with this ridiculous idea of eminent domain, I'm sorry to say. And in fact, my next report to the UN General Assembly in the fall is on eminent domain and on the idea of land and its relationship to housing. Is land necessary for housing or not? And if so, what needs to be done to make sure that housing can be produced enough of a good quality for everyone? That's a key question that I'm asking in the report. And I welcome inputs from anybody who wants to contribute. It'll be an open call for inputs. So, but it's such a critical question that you've raised. It's at the heart of not just the approach to housing, but the approach to development as a whole. Development strategy as a whole depends on the relationship with land. And as we saw from the examples about conflict, it also is a root cause of conflict and ultimately war.
Hello. Sorry, I arrived a little bit late, so I'm not sure if they did a land acknowledgement before you started
Yeah.
speaking. Okay. That's the root of my question. You've just touched on some of the other countries in the world and how the land was divided up beforehand. In the last 10 years here, and specifically in Ottawa, we've become land acknowledgement devotees in all sorts of forms. I'm a first-generation Canadian, so I sometimes find it very hypocritical because they say, yes, it's your land, but we're not going to give it back to you, and you're still not considered people, and we still treat you like crap. Is there any other country that has a kind of land acknowledgement attitude anywhere? Or is it just us being kind of hypocritical?
I don't know. I mean, in the US, we do have certain places where land acknowledgement has become more common. But I don't know about other settler colonial states, including Australia and New Zealand. I'm not sure about that.
Not that you're aware of it.
No, not that I'm aware of it.
I think we'll have one last question, Ola. Then
My question was about roles of civil society. I mean, we're now, in light of the war in Sudan, it's very interesting that now the focus primarily is on the role of civil society that has, mass kind of become distributed all around the world, really, because of mass displacement. And I always wonder about that in relation to law, in terms of how, within the country, the civil society is also kind of a recipient of these rules and regulations. And now, in the sort of narrative of that there is a destruction, civil society and its enactment on this law is kind of called upon. While when we were within the land, that was never kind of given any, so I just generally would like to know your thought on that relationship between civil society and law in relation to land.
Well, yeah, I mean, civil society, by which if you mean the spontaneous form of non-state space of various kinds, this is the broadest sort of definition one can think of, which includes not just non-profit organized community-based space, but also any non-state-based space, which in the 1990s, the theoreticians of civil society in the context of the Eastern European transition actually included market institutions in the definition of civil society because it's not the state, including unions, for example. Are unions part of civil society or not? And so there was a lot of disagreement over this issue. For example, the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas famously disagreed that unions should be part of civil society at all. It should be entirely non-profit and non-state. So there are all these disagreements, and the reason why that's important is because the splintering of civil society is in two ways, right? One is the actual sort of civil society as a community of people who are themselves affected by adverse policies, but who choose to advocate for either themselves or for others like them, or for others who are not like them, but still they would like to, advocate for them. That is the traditional idea of civil society, but civil society also means those who are not part of organized society. So informal settlements where workers are scrounging for living by engaging in occupations that are not regulated, what sector do they belong to? What are they? And what we see is a crackdown or negative impact against both. The crackdown or negative impact against organized civil society, say NGOs, is real. It's vicious when it comes to land. Among the most risky kinds of things you can advocate for as an NGO is to advocate for housing and land rights in the world. You're sure to be a target by powerful interests, whether state or non-state. More likely that something bad will happen to you fairly soon. And I deal with those cases all the time with the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. But what happens to the other part of civil society, particularly those who are not quite advocating for change, but who are trying to simply live a life on the margins of society. They're not, because they're not part of anything organized. They're not in an organized employment. They're not part of organized labor unions. They don't have anybody else defending them. What happens to them is also something that we should pay attention to. Like fishermen, I would say fisher folk, like in the Rempang, case in Indonesia, the biggest impact in the island is on the indigenous communities that depends on their relationship to the sea. Their entire livelihood and their culture depends on having access to the ocean. But that is being taken away. Now, are they part of civil society? And I mean, the NGOs that advocate for them themselves might come under pressure, and that might become news. But we have to think about the impact more broadly, the fisher folk themselves or civil society. So when we say civil society impact, we have to consider not just NGOs doing advocacy, but communities like these, right? Otherwise, we miss out on the scale of what's really happening to civil society. And land and housing are certainly among the most important sort of issues around which civil society mobilizes.
I know there were some students who still had questions, so maybe they can come up for 5 minutes and talk to you. But I just want to, sort of say as a concluding remark, the second-year students in the School of Architecture this weekend did a competition, and it's a 3 or 4 day competition organized by the Canadian Centre for Architecture. And we just looked at the entries today, and my fellow instructors and I were so struck by the fact that all these young people, who were about 19 or 20, decided to analyze their hometown, Ottawa, or where they're studying, let's say, and all of them had this, their radar, their antenna was so high to look at, let's say, injustices in a way, or divisions within the city, and somehow record them and explain them. And they explained them in elegant and clear language, in very, very compelling drawings, and none of their instructors pushed them to do this. In fact, we said, do this weekend, we're going home, goodbye, and we'll see you on Monday. And lo and behold, all these young people show up with, and without necessarily being prophetic or having an activist mind or being overly polemical, but I say this as a note of encouragement, but also of optimism, because Raj, you told me over dinner last night that in fact you remain an eternal optimist. So on that note, I wish to thank you. So please join me again in thanking Balakrishnan Rajagopal.